In 1922, Joseph Klimek was so sick that his family decided they had to get him away from his wife. For weeks, Joseph had been dealing with terrible stomach pain. He was weak, he could barely eat, and instead of getting better, he seemed to be getting worse by the day. His family finally took him to the hospital. That decision may have saved his life. Doctors examined Joseph and discovered that he had arsenic in his body. Now, arsenic poisoning was already serious enough. But then investigators started looking into Joseph's wife, Tillie. They learned that several men connected to her had died after suffering from similar stomach problems. One of them was her previous husband. And according to witnesses, Tillie had been talking about that husband's funeral way before he was even dead. By the time police finished digging into her past, they were reopening graves, questioning women throughout the neighborhood, and investigating a list of deaths and illnesses that had grown to nearly 20 people. But how many of those cases were actually connected to Tillie? And was she really the woman who could predict death? Or was that part of a story created after her arrest? Today, we're going back through the Tillie Klimek case to separate what investigators could prove from everything that grew into legend. Welcome. I'm Ivy Monroe, and this is the Her Strange Hour podcast, where I uncover strange history, unsolved mysteries, and the forgotten women of the past. Stay with me. At the end, I'll be sharing the rare, surviving images from this very case. Now, the story of Tillie Klimek. Before she was Tillie Klimek, her name was Otilia, or possibly Teofila, Burek. Even the records do not completely agree on that. She was born in Poland sometime during the 1870s and came to the United States with her family when she was young. They settled in Chicago, inside a growing Polish immigrant community that was often called Little Poland. This was a place where families lived close together. People attended the same churches, visited the same shops, and often knew exactly what was happening inside their neighbors' homes. And Tillie seemed to fit into that community just fine. People knew her as a good housekeeper and a very good cook. That detail would later appear in nearly every version of her story, because food would become an important part of the accusations against her. But at this point, there was no major reason for anyone to see Tillie as dangerous. Very little reliable information survives about her childhood or teenage years. Some later accounts make big claims about what she was like from an early age, but there simply are not enough records to support most of them. What we do know is that by 1895, Tillie had married a man named Joseph Mitkowitz. You may hear his first name given as John in some versions of this case. The spelling of several names also changes depending on the source. These were Polish names being recorded by English-speaking reporters, court employees, and census workers, so the records are not always consistent. Tillie and Joseph were together for close to 20 years. That is important because some retellings make it sound like she was marrying and burying men every few months from the beginning. That was not the case. Her first known marriage lasted for years. Then, in January 1914, Joseph became sick. The surviving reports do not give us a detailed day-by-day account of his illness. What they do tell us is that it was fairly short and involved the kind of symptoms that could easily be blamed on a stomach problem, heart trouble, or an ordinary illness. Joseph died on January 13, 1914. At the time, his death was not treated as a murder. There was no dramatic investigation, no immediate arrest, and no doctor announcing that poison had been found. Joseph's death was recorded as heart trouble, his funeral was held, and he was buried. As far as everyone around Tillie knew, she was now a widow who had lost her husband after nearly 2 decades of marriage. But only a few weeks later, Tillie married again. Her new husband was another neighborhood man named Joseph Ryskowski, although, once again, you will see his first name and surname written differently depending on which account you read. They married on February 27, 1914. That was about 6 weeks after her first husband died. A quick remarriage may have raised a few eyebrows, but by itself, it did not prove anything. Tillie needed financial security, and remarriage soon after the death of a spouse was not unheard of at the time. Still, this second marriage would not last long. By May, Joseph Ruskowski was also sick, and on May 20th, less than 3 months after marrying Tillie, he died. So, in the first 5 months of 1914, Tillie had buried 2 husbands. Both men had become sick before their deaths. Both deaths were accepted without a serious criminal investigation, and Tillie was free to move forward with her life. Years would pass before authorities returned to those graves. By then, another man would be dead. And for the first time, someone would begin asking whether Tillie's husbands were dying from natural causes, or whether something had been added to the food coming out of her kitchen. So after Tillie's second husband died, the story becomes a little harder to follow. Some accounts say she became involved with another man. Others describe him as a boyfriend, a fiancé, or even another husband. His name is usually given as Joseph Grant-Kowski, although the spelling changes from one source to another. The story repeated most often is that Joseph planned to marry Tillie, but at some point he changed his mind. According to later reports, Joseph may have heard Tillie say something disturbing about one of her former husbands. Some versions claim he threatened to go to the police. Then Joseph died, which I found highly suspicious. That sounds like an important part of the case. But the surviving accounts do not agree on exactly what happened, when he died, or even what kind of relationship he had with Tillie. So to the best of my knowledge, based off the research I was able to find, we cannot say with certainty that Tillie poisoned him. What we can say is that years later, when investigators began making a list of suspicious deaths around her, Joseph's name appeared on it. By then, Tillie had already moved on. Sometime around 1919, she married a man named Frank Kupchak. Frank lived and worked in Chicago's Polish community. He and Tillie eventually made their home at 924 North Winchester Avenue. From the outside, this probably looked like another chance for Tillie to settle into married life. She was known as a capable housekeeper. She could cook, and she knew how to manage a home. And Frank eventually trusted her enough to eat the meals she prepared. For a while, nothing seemed unusual. Then Frank became sick. It started with stomach trouble. Then he lost his appetite. He became weak. And instead of recovering after a few days, the illness continued. People around the couple watched Frank get thinner and sicker. But Tillie did not always behave like a wife who believed her husband might recover. She began talking about his death as though it had already been decided. Neighbors later claimed that Tillie told them Frank would not be around much longer. As I was reading that, I can't wrap my mind around what her neighbors were thinking. At one point, she reportedly joked that he had only 2 inches to live. It was a strange thing to say about a man who was still alive, but it was not the only thing people remembered. According to Tillie's landlady, Tillie began working on the clothing she planned to wear to Frank's funeral. I just thought that was so weird. Some reports describe it as a mourning hat. Others call it a veil. Either way, Tillie was preparing to dress as a widow while her husband was still lying sick inside their home. And then there was the coffin. The landlady later testified that Tillie found one at a discounted price and asked whether she could store it in the basement. Just think about that for a second. Frank had not died. No doctor had told the family that his death was only hours away. But Tillie was already making funeral arrangements. The coffin story would later become one of the most repeated details from her trial. At the time, though, nobody stopped her. Maybe the neighbors thought Tillie was being practical. Maybe they believed Frank's condition was worse than they realized. Or maybe Tillie had spoken about his death so often that people had started accepting it as something that was bound to happen. Frank died in April of 1921. Once again, Tillie buried a husband without anyone immediately accusing her of murder. There was no arsenic investigation. His body was not tested for poison. And the comments Tillie had made before his death did not lead police to her door, which is just crazy to me. Frank was buried, and Tillie became a widow again, but she would not stay one for long. Before the year was over, Tillie married another man. His name was Joseph Klimek, and unlike the husbands who came before him, Joseph would live long enough to tell people what had been happening inside Tillie's home. Joseph Klimek knew that Tillie had been married before. He may have even known Frank. But whatever people in the neighborhood had heard about Tillie's past, it did not stop Joseph from marrying her. I want us to just pause for a second. So it's possible he knew her previous husband and about her past, but still went along with it anyway. That's just mind-blowing that he would put himself in that situation. But again, this is just speculation. By 1921, Tillie was using his last name. And at first, their marriage probably did not look much different from the ones around them. Joseph worked, Tillie took care of the home, and once again, she prepared the food. Then Joseph started getting sick. It began with stomach problems. He could not keep much food down. He became weak. His condition continued to get worse, even though Tillie was supposed to be caring for him. And this time, his family was paying attention. They did not believe Joseph was suffering from an ordinary illness. Something about the situation felt wrong to them. Maybe it was how quickly he was getting worse. Maybe it was Tillie's behavior. Or maybe people had finally started remembering how many men had become sick after marrying her. Whatever caused their concern, Joseph's relatives made a decision. They removed him from the house. That was the moment Tillie lost control of what happened next. Joseph was taken to a hospital, where doctors could examine him without Tillie standing nearby or preparing his meals. And the doctors found arsenic in his system. Joseph had not simply caught a stomach illness. Someone had been poisoning him. News of the discovery spread quickly. Police began asking questions about Tillie, and once they started looking into her past, they found far more than one sick husband. They found Frank, who had died the year before. They found the two husbands Tillie had buried during 1914. And they heard the stories people had been telling about the woman who always seemed to know when someone was about to die. Tillie was arrested in October 1922. According to newspaper reports, she did not seem frightened or shocked when officers came for her. One story claims that while she was being taken into custody, Tillie told an officer that he was the next person she wanted to cook dinner for. Whether she said those exact words is difficult to prove. Newspapers loved a memorable quote, especially when the person being accused was a woman. But the line followed Tillie for the rest of her life. And honestly, it was easy to understand why. By this point, investigators believed the kitchen might have been the place where Tillie carried out her crimes. Arsenic could be mixed into food or drinks. The symptoms could look like a serious stomach illness. And if the poison was given in smaller amounts over time, the victim might slowly become weaker while everyone around them assumed they were dying from natural causes. That may have been what happened to Joseph. But unlike the men before him, Joseph was no longer eating Tillie's food. He survived. His recovery was not quick. Reports said he remained seriously ill for months after Tillie's arrest. But he was alive. And because Joseph lived, doctors had more than a body in a grave. They had a living man with arsenic inside him. Now police wanted to know whether the same poison could still be found inside Tillie's former husbands. So they began reopening graves. Frank Kupchik's body was exhumed first. Investigators examined his remains and reported finding a deadly amount of arsenic. They also tested the soil surrounding his grave. That mattered because arsenic could sometimes be found naturally in cemetery soil or come from materials once used during burial. But according to the prosecution, the soil around Frank did not contain enough arsenic to explain what was found inside his body. The poison had been there before he was buried. Frank's death was no longer being treated as an unfortunate illness. Police believed he had been murdered. Then investigators returned to the husbands who had died years earlier. The graves of Joseph Mitkovich and Joseph Ruskowski were opened. Newspaper reports said arsenic was found in their remains too. Now the situation looked very different. Tillie had not simply lost several husbands. Several husbands had become sick. Several had died. And arsenic had reportedly followed them into their graves. But the investigation did not stop with the men Tillie had married. Once the story reached the newspapers, people from the neighborhood began coming forward. Some said they had become sick after eating food Tillie prepared. Others remembered relatives who died after spending time inside her home. 2 women reportedly claimed they became ill after Tillie gave them candy. Even the death of a neighborhood dog was added to the growing list. As you can see, this was way out of hand, and it was possible that nobody around her was safe, not even the pets. Before long, police were looking into nearly 20 deaths, illnesses, and disappearances connected to Tillie, her relatives, and people around them. That was something that was unheard of. But that number would create a problem, because the newspapers began reporting it as though Tillie had already been proven responsible for every one of those cases. Without there being a full investigation yet, this was just an assumption. She had not been proven guilty of anything yet. Some of the people on that list survived. Some of the deaths were connected more closely to another woman. And some of the stories may have grown after frightened neighbors saw Tillie's name across the front page. Still, the arsenic found in Joseph and Frank gave police a case they believed they could prove. And then Tillie gave them another name, her cousin, Nellie Koulik. Tillie claimed Nellie had helped her get the poison. That accusation would turn one suspected poisoning into something much larger. And the case grew much darker after they learned this. Because police were no longer asking whether Tillie had acted alone. They were beginning to wonder whether several women in the neighborhood had been poisoning people together. I just want to add this side note that I came across while researching this. Joseph Klimek's arsenic poisoning was reported in October 1922 and led directly to Tillie's arrest. Contemporary newspaper coverage also reported the later exhumations and arsenic findings, though the wider list of nearly 20 cases included allegations connected to multiple people, not 20 murders proven against Tillie. Once Tillie was arrested, police wanted to know where she had gotten the arsenic. At the time, poison was much easier to buy than it is today. Arsenic could be found in products used to kill rats and other pests. You did not need access to a laboratory. You did not need to be a doctor. A person could buy poison and bring it home without attracting much attention. But Tillie told investigators that she had not handled everything on her own. She gave them the name of her cousin, Nellie Koulik. You may also see Nellie's last name spelled Koulik. Like several people in this story, her name was recorded differently from one newspaper to another. According to Tillie, she had once complained to Nellie about Frank Kupchik. Tillie claimed Nellie suggested that she leave him, but Tillie supposedly had another idea. She wanted to get rid of Frank permanently. Tillie then accused Nellie of helping her obtain rat poison. Some reports identify the product as Rough on Rats, a well-known poison sold during that period. Now, we have to be careful here. This was Tillie's version of events, and Tillie had every reason to shift some of the blame onto someone else. Nellie denied helping her poison Frank. Still, police took the accusation seriously. They arrested Nellie and began looking into the deaths inside her family too. And that is when the investigation became much bigger than Tillie. Nellie's husband had died. Several children and grandchildren connected to her household had also died or become seriously ill. Some of those deaths may have had perfectly ordinary explanations. Childhood illness was common. Medical care was limited. And families living in crowded working-class neighborhoods often dealt with diseases that could spread quickly. But now police were viewing every death through a different lens. If someone had suffered from vomiting, stomach pain, or weakness before dying, investigators wondered about arsenic. If that person had eaten a meal prepared by Tillie or Nellie, their name could be added to the list. And if money or insurance was involved, the suspicion became even stronger. Before long, newspapers were reporting that police had uncovered a group of women who poisoned their husbands and relatives. They called it the Bluebeard Clique. That name came from an old story about a wealthy man who murdered his wives. Newspapers later used the word Bluebeard for people accused of repeatedly marrying and killing their spouses. But in Tillie's case, reporters flipped the story. Now they were describing women as the Bluebeards. And they did not stop there. Tillie was called the leader of the group. Some newspapers even described her as its high priestess. That made the story sound like a secret society. A group of women trading poison, collecting insurance money, and helping one another get rid of unwanted husbands. It was the kind of story newspapers knew people would buy. But police never proved that a large, organized group existed. Other women were questioned. Some were arrested. Most were eventually released. And Nellie's connection to the case was not nearly as clear as early headlines suggested. Tillie and Nellie were held in custody together for a time. According to newspaper stories, Tillie remained unusually cheerful. She joked with guards. She laughed. And she sometimes seemed more interested in the attention surrounding the case than in the possibility that she could be sentenced to death. Reporters gave her another name. They called her the Mary Murderess of the Cook County Jail. That nickname appeared because Tillie did not behave the way people expected an accused woman to behave. She was not constantly crying. She did not appear ashamed in front of reporters. And she did not beg the public to believe she was innocent. Instead, Tillie sometimes smiled. She made jokes. And whether that was her real personality, a way of hiding fear, or simply another newspaper exaggeration, it shaped how people viewed her. One story claimed that Tillie tormented Nellie while they were jailed together. Tillie supposedly convinced her cousin that officers were coming to take her away and hang her. Nellie became terrified. Tillie thought it was funny. Again, that story came through newspaper reporting, so we cannot know exactly how the exchange happened. But it fit the version of Tillie the public had already been given. A woman who joked about death. A woman who prepared mourning clothes before her husband died. A woman who supposedly offered to cook for the officer arresting her. By the time Tillie went to trial, she was no longer being discussed as an ordinary defendant. She had become a character. And that created a problem. Because the case against her included real evidence. Frank's remains reportedly contained arsenic. Joseph Klimek had survived arsenic poisoning. And witnesses were prepared to describe the things Tillie had said and done before Frank died. But mixed in with that evidence were rumors, nicknames, and accusations connected to people Tillie had never been proven to harm. The public heard that nearly 20 people might be involved. They heard about a poisoning ring. They heard that Tillie could predict death. And many people had already decided what she was before a jury heard the first witness. Nellie would eventually face a jury too. But unlike Tillie, she would not be convicted. The charge that she supplied the poison could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Nellie was found not guilty. Tillie, however, still had to answer for Frank. And prosecutors believed the things she had said before his death would help send her to prison for the rest of her life. Tillie Klimek went on trial in March of 1923. She was charged with murdering Frank Kupchik, not Joseph Klimek, the husband who survived. not the two husbands who died in 1914, and not every neighbor or relative whose name had appeared in the newspapers. Prosecutors focused on Frank because they believed his death gave them the strongest case. His body had been exhumed. Arsenic had reportedly been found in his remains, and several witnesses were ready to tell the jury how Tillie behaved while Frank was still alive. The prosecution argued that this was not a woman surprised by her husband's death. Tillie had been expecting it, maybe even planning for it. One witness described Tillie talking openly about how little time Frank had left. Another remembered the remark that he had only 2 inches to live. And then Tillie's landlady took the stand. She told the jury about the mourning clothes Tillie had worked on while Frank was still sick. Depending on the report, it was described as a hat, a veil, or part of the outfit she planned to wear to his funeral. The exact item mattered less than the timing. Frank was alive, but Tillie was already preparing to appear as his widow. The landlady also told the jury about the coffin. Tillie had reportedly found one at a reduced price, and she wanted to know whether she could keep it in the basement until Frank needed it. You can imagine how that sounded inside a courtroom. A sick man upstairs, his wife preparing mourning clothes, and a coffin waiting below. But those details alone did not prove murder. People sometimes prepare for death when a loved one is seriously ill. A person can say something cruel or strange without being a killer. The arsenic was what gave those stories more weight. Doctors and experts testified about what had been found in Frank's body. The prosecution argued that the amount was too high to be accidental. They also addressed the possibility that arsenic had entered his remains after burial. Testing of the soil around the grave was used to support their position that the poison had been inside Frank before he was buried. Then there was Joseph Klimek. He was living proof that someone inside Tillie's home had access to arsenic. Joseph had eaten food prepared there. He had become seriously ill. And after he was removed from Tillie's care, doctors found poison in his body. Even though Tillie was not being tried for attempting to kill Joseph, his experience made the prosecution's version of Frank's death much easier for the jury to believe. Tillie testified in her own defense. She denied murdering Frank. She also denied knowingly poisoning Joseph. Her defense challenged the prosecution's evidence and questioned whether arsenic found in a body long after burial could truly show when or how the poison had entered it. They also had to deal with the stories surrounding Tillie. By this point, jurors had probably heard that she was suspected in nearly 20 cases. They had seen headlines about a poisoning ring. They had heard her described as a woman who predicted deaths. But most of those accusations were not the case in front of them. The jury was supposed to decide one question. Did Tillie Klimek poison Frank Kupchak? Still, separating the evidence from everything printed about her would not have been easy. Reporters covered more than the testimony. They wrote about Tillie's clothes, her weight, her face, the way she spoke English, and whether she smiled in court. Some reports compared her with other women who had been accused of murder in Chicago, women the newspapers considered more attractive. The suggestion was not subtle. Pretty women could sometimes gain sympathy from a jury. Tillie probably would not. None of that changed the arsenic evidence, but it showed that Tillie was being judged for more than the death of Frank Kupchak. She was a Polish immigrant. She was working class. She did not look or behave the way reporters believed a frightened woman should. And once they decided she was cold, strange, or unattractive, they repeated it until that description became part of the case. Tillie did not help herself. She smiled at times. She spoke casually. And according to reporters, she continued making jokes even while prosecutors were asking the jury to consider the death penalty. Maybe she believed she would be acquitted. Maybe joking was how she handled fear. Or maybe the stories about her personality were true. We cannot know exactly what Tillie was thinking as she sat in that courtroom. What we do know is that the jury did not believe her. After hearing the medical evidence and witness testimony, they found Tillie Klimek guilty of murdering Frank Kupchak. Some jurors reportedly wanted her sentenced to death, but they did not reach the agreement required to send her to the gallows. Instead, Tillie received life in prison. She had escaped execution, but she would never be free again. And even after the verdict, one question remained. Had the jury convicted a woman who murdered one husband, or had they finally stopped someone who had been poisoning people for years? After the verdict, Tillie Klimek was sentenced to life in prison. She had avoided the death penalty, but she was never going home. Tillie was sent away in 1923, and the woman who had once been known around her neighborhood as a good cook and housekeeper was now one of the most talked about female prisoners in Illinois. The newspapers kept writing about her. They repeated the old nicknames: the Mary Murderess, the woman who predicted death, the leader of a supposed poisoning ring. But once Tillie entered prison, the attention slowly began to fade. There were no more husbands, no more funerals, and no more neighbors coming forward with stories about candy, meals, or strange illnesses. Tillie remained behind bars for the rest of her life. She died in November of 1936, about 13 years after her conviction. She was still a prisoner. By then, many of the accusations that once filled the newspapers had never gone any further. Tillie had been convicted of one murder, Frank Kupchak. Joseph Klimek had survived what doctors believed was arsenic poisoning, and arsenic was reportedly found in the remains of 2 earlier husbands. That evidence is why most historians believe Frank was not Tillie's only victim. But the larger number connected to her name is much harder to defend. Some reports claimed she may have poisoned nearly 20 people. That does not mean 20 people died, and it does not mean police proved Tillie was responsible for every illness or suspicious death on that list. Some people survived. Some of the cases were connected more closely to Nellie Koulik. Others came from neighbors who spoke to police only after Tillie's arrest became front-page news. Once people learned that arsenic might be involved, every old stomach illness began to look suspicious. Every sudden death raised new questions, and every argument someone remembered having with Tillie became part of the story. That does not mean those people were lying. Some of them may have been telling the truth, but it does mean we have to separate what was proven from what was suspected. Nellie was eventually acquitted. The state could not prove that she supplied Tillie with poison or helped her kill Frank. The larger poisoning ring described in the newspapers was never proven either. There may have been more than one woman using arsenic inside that community, or the press may have taken one real murder case and stretched it into something much bigger. Possibly both. And then there is the story that Tillie could predict death. Later retellings often describe her as almost psychic, a woman who dreamed about funerals and then watched those dreams come true. But the reporting from Tillie's time gives us something less supernatural and honestly, more disturbing. Tillie did not need visions. She made comments about men dying. She prepared mourning clothes. She reportedly bought a coffin while Frank was still alive. And if the prosecution was right, she knew exactly what was going to happen because she was causing it. That is the part of Tillie's story that stays with me. Not the nicknames, not the rumors about secret groups of women, not even the supernatural version created around her later. It is the fact that several men became sick inside the same woman's home. Most of them died. And the only reason the pattern was uncovered was because one man survived long enough to get away from her food. Joseph Klimek lived, and because he lived, doctors found the arsenic. Police reopened Frank's grave. Witnesses finally spoke about the coffin, the mourning clothes, and the things Tillie had said before her husband died. Without Joseph, Tillie may never have been arrested. Frank's death might have remained an illness. The earlier husbands might have stayed buried without anyone questioning what killed them. And Tillie may have married again. We will never know exactly how many people she poisoned. We may never know whether money was her only motive, or whether some of the accusations involving neighbors and relatives were true. But a jury believed she murdered Frank Kupchak, and the evidence surrounding Joseph's survival made it very difficult to believe Frank was the first. Okay, so I want to briefly go over what Tillie's case became after her death, and why the legend may now be better known than the woman herself. After Tillie Klimek died, the story did not disappear. It changed. Over time, the details became cleaner than the real case ever was. Tillie was no longer described as a woman convicted of poisoning one husband and suspected in several other cases. She became the psychic widow, the woman who dreamed about death, the woman who predicted exactly when each husband would die, the leader of a secret group of female poisoners. And, depending on which version you hear, the number of people connected to her can climb as high as 20. But the real story is more complicated. Tillie was convicted of murdering Frank Kupchak. Her final husband, Joseph Klimek, survived with arsenic in his body. Arsenic was reportedly found after 2 earlier husbands were exhumed. Those facts alone are enough to make this a serious case. We do not need to add anything supernatural to make it interesting. At the same time, we cannot confidently place every suspicious death in that neighborhood at Tillie's feet. Some of those cases were never proven. Some were connected more closely to Nellie. And some may have been ordinary illnesses that looked different once everyone knew a poisoner had been living nearby. With a lot of conflicting information going around, it makes Tillie's case in some ways difficult to separate the truth from some of the theories. There was real evidence, but there was also fear. There were witnesses who remembered disturbing comments, but there were also newspapers looking for the most shocking version of the story and adding to it and influencing people's opinions. And there was a woman who seemed completely comfortable joking about death, even while facing the possibility of execution. When I think about it, it's possible that maybe Tillie enjoyed frightening people, or maybe she liked knowing something they did not, or maybe she simply believed nobody would ever connect the men buried behind her to the food she served inside her home. For years, she was right to assume she would never get caught. Her first husband died, and no one investigated. Her second husband died only months later, and no one investigated. Frank died after Tillie reportedly prepared for his funeral ahead of time, and still, no one investigated. It took Joseph surviving to finally break the pattern. I think the only reason more people didn't die was because he survived. Thank God his family stayed on top of things. Joseph's family noticed something was wrong. They removed him from the home. Doctors tested him. And once arsenic was found, they had to start looking into Tillie's past, which honestly should have happened sooner. Tillie Klimek spent the rest of her life in prison, as she should have. Whether she killed 3 people, 5 people, or more, we may never know. But the evidence strongly suggests that Frank Kupchak was not the only person she poisoned. And behind all the nicknames, exaggerated headlines, and stories about psychic dreams, there were real people. Men who became sick inside their own homes. Families who buried relatives without knowing what had happened. And one survivor whose illness finally gave investigators the chance to look back. That is the story of Tillie Klimek. Not a supernatural widow who could see the future. A woman who may have known when death was coming because she had already set it in motion. So what do you think? Did she poison 20 people? Did she act alone, or did she have help from Nellie or someone else? Let me know in the comments. And as promised, I am going to share pictures of Tillie, Nellie, Joe, and various news articles and pictures from court. Thank you for listening. I'm Ivy Monroe, and this is the Her Strange Hour podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe on YouTube so you do not miss the next story. See you next week, and until next time, take care of yourself, and I'll meet you back here for another strange story.